the biggest help for me was immediately finding the organization. Like that's what made almost day and night for me, and for me to be able to get up and be like, oh wait, unfortunately, I'm not alone. And I say unfortunately because I would never hope that anyone would join, this group.
They just can't find an answer to what's going on. So it ranges dramatically for people when they go there on what they're being seen for. But he was accepted into that program. And so we were just stunned and in his job. Like, we kept him alive for so many years. Like, how did we lose him within a 10-minute window? Like, we could not wrap our heads around this.
Hello, AGSAA and caregivers. You're listening to the Rare Advocacy podcast, brought to you by Aicardi-Goutières Syndrome Advocacy Association. I'm Betty, your host and mom of Noah, who has Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome. A special thanks to our podcast sponsor, Biogen, who continues to help us with this podcast. So join us for insightful conversations and updates about Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome, rare diseases, and disabilities. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. This really helps spread awareness. So if you haven't done this, just take a brief moment and share your review on whatever platform you're listening to us from. And don't forget, we're here to support you every step of the way, and we'll make a difference together. And for this episode, I'm going to go ahead and bring our guest to the screen. Her name is Megan. Hi, Megan. How are you doing?
Hi, Betty. I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. I'm glad we're taking the time to sit down, chit chat, and just talk about life in general. Megan, we met through the Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome Advocacy Association, but it wasn't always called Advocacy Association. It was America's, right? And you were one of our founding caregivers, mothers, parents. Could you tell me a little bit more about yourself and how you got involved with the association to begin with?
Sure. Yeah. Well, happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Betty. I'm excited. I got involved with the organization because there were just, I'd seen even just a handful, maybe a dozen kids with AGS at that point. The diagnostic testing was so early. It was not specific for each mutation yet. And so there were more children diagnosed with certain mutations than others. Like, my own son wasn't really diagnosed at that point, or he was newly diagnosed, I suppose, when we decided to form this organization. But there were not many children. There was not the network and the group that exists today, this very supportive Facebook conversation and, real, I'd say, go-to place for questions among parents, for questions for caregivers, for answers in any way, shape, or form. And so, I think forming this organization the way we did with Stephanie Weinberg and myself and Gina Hammond, and I guess her last name might be Banton now, Luke's mom. So we were the three that organized this initially because we had a donation. We had a sizable gift that Stephanie had received through one of her family friends and a young woman who raised money for AGS and was very close with her daughter, Abby. And she had received this very, very generous, like 6-figure donation. And we didn't really know what to do with it. Like, we needed an organization that could receive it. And so we very quickly set up a 501c3 and received these dollars, and then started working on sort of our bylaws and tried to put all these other pieces in place after the fact. And what does this organization do? What is the strategic focus? What's the mission? How do we help support families, children and parents and caregivers who are going through this AGS journey? And that was our forming mission. I would say it continues to be our mission. And it's really, the root of how we started to band together. So this donation sort of forced our hand into doing this, but we knew we were already coming together on the side and trying to just like be a support group for each other, right? There's another mom who was part of this team as well. She unfortunately lost her son, Eli, and her name is Christina. And so she was part of this group as well. And again, it was really meant to be, I think, this organization that comes together to support our families and what their needs might be.
Yes. That's, I mean, as a still fairly newly diagnosed family, because Noah was diagnosed a little bit over, what year are we on? It'll be almost right. He was diagnosed in 2022, so almost 2 years, but it just feels like yesterday some days. The biggest help for me was immediately finding the organization. Like that's what made almost day and night for me, and for me to be able to get up and be like, oh wait, unfortunately I'm not alone. And I say unfortunately because I would never hope that anyone would join this group. Yeah. But I am so thankful for the group. And that's why I wanted to start the podcast immediately saying thank you to you, Stephanie and Jenna, and just everyone who took time out of their journey to be like, hey, this is something that our community needs, and we need to come together and be there for each other and have this support system that understands. I think that's like the way I feel. I'm like, they understand, they get me, and they can give me some advice, and some of them are ahead of me in this journey. And it's nice to just share things and get the support that I'm not getting in where I live, essentially.
Yeah. And I think, the hard part about AGS, there are many, many hard parts about living with AGS for our children, taking care of a child with AGS, all those pieces. And I think one of the challenges is that there continues to be this lack of information about just the disease, right? Just the challenge of Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome. And there's so many unknowns. There's so many answers, questions that don't have answers yet. It's so much further in 2024 than it was when we started this journey, which was in 2002. My son started to lose motor function in 2000. I'd say like late 2002, 2003. So he was about 2 years old. So he could walk and talk and had motor control, and then slowly lost it over about a 3-year period. So by 5, he was living in a wheelchair. But we didn't have any answers and have an Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome, an AGS diagnosis, until he was 14 years old. And so for us, it was a really long journey with just living in this very gray, murky space for many, many years. And, watching him lose function, having him live a certain lifestyle and live in a wheelchair and need everything done for him when he was able to feed himself and hold utensils and, do all of these other things that indicated, a different sort of meeting these milestones where we thought he was healthy and things were progressing in the right direction. And then they just weren't. And no one had any answers. And I know that people still have a long diagnostic journey in this day and age, right? Like they don't get an AGS diagnosis quickly, or they might, but that's not what it is. And so, the frustration of living in this unknown space with even an AGS diagnosis, and then, no answers around, well, what is the prognosis? Like, what are my expectations on lifespan and quality of life? and,
So many
a
things.
cure and treatment options, right? So I really like, again, I wish no one was in that Facebook group and coming to each other for support. The reality is that they are. And so it is a fantastic resource for people to at least figure out how to get started and understand and feel like there's this connected community of others who understand what they might be going through on a daily basis, on a procedural basis. What about doing Botox? What about vaccines? Right, like just this community that can be supportive for each other and come together.
Yes, yes. I love that you started sharing a little bit about your journey and your family's journey. So if it's all right, I would like us to go back to the beginning when everything started. Do you have just one, did you have one or do you have multiple kids?
I have 4 children. So Jackson was my oldest. Yeah. And it's interesting because he started to lose some motor function when my second child was born. So they're 18 months apart. And he started to just show some muscle weakness and not say wanting to bear some weight on his feet, right? Like his feet seemed like they were turning in a little bit when he was standing and walking. And we were like, what's going on? Are we imagining this? They were so subtle at first that it was hard for us to recognize. And then when we did recognize it and took him to the pediatrician, they told us we were imagining it. Like, oh, he's a boy, he's later, all these sort of things that made me question as a first-time parent that I knew what I was talking about. And so my second child was born, and within about maybe 6 months of her arrival, so this was like June of 2003, he was 2 years old, just over 2 years old. He really didn't want to bear any weight on his legs anymore. Like he would stand up and then just plop right down. But he had trunk control, head control, arms, hands, he could feed himself. He could still move, but he was like commando crawling everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so he could walk, but with assistance, right? So we were starting to see this regression, but it was so subtle that until we saw this type of disconnect, no one was really taking us too seriously. And so at that point, we took him back to the pediatrician. They said, okay, we think you need to see a neurologist, like something is different. The neurologist, did an MRI. There was no, there was nothing they could see on the MRI, right? Mm-hmm. No explanation for any changes in his brain, white matter, or any hypoxic areas, or no, damage that they could see. And they told us that, he had cerebral palsy and we just never noticed it. Right. And so our experience with neurologists early, this was in 2003, was pretty poor. Right. They told us that, he had CP and we just never noticed, and we didn't realize that he couldn't, do certain things. And we said, well, he could do these things and now he can't. Like, that's a loss of skill. And so, the neurologists weren't too helpful at that point in time, because I think just historically, like that practice hadn't progressed very quickly. So, if your child didn't have a diagnosis or something like CP, this umbrella diagnosis, or epilepsy and seizures and things that were very clear in a box, they really couldn't think outside the box at that point, for us anyway. And so they sent us to the genetic and metabolic clinic and that team of people at Children's. And we were doing all of this in Denver because we live in Colorado. And so, when we got to the genetic and metabolic team, they said, oh, for sure he has something metabolic and or genetic. And really, like, both those things go hand in hand, but you can't really separate them. And so they were already counseling us that he had Tay-Sachs disease or Canavan disease, or, a rare and orphan disease that falls under that category of illness. And we said, okay, well, let's, like, before we, hear these diagnoses, like, because they're fatal and pretty terrible, let's do the testing, because, we weren't in a demographic of people that had a higher
risk
percentage or higher risk of one of those diseases, right? Like, neither one of us are Jewish, or we don't have any history of Ashkenazi Jew, particularly in our family. And so, they're a rare and orphan disease even within that population of people, right? And so outside of that population, it's even more unlikely. And so all those tests came back negative. And they said, gosh, we really thought this was what was going on. We're going to retest them again. We went through that cycle again, right? So all these cycles were taking 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, and coming back negative. And in the meantime, he's losing more function. And, they did a test for AGS in 2003. And at that point in time, the way that you were diagnosed for AGS was a lumbar puncture with the spinal fluid sent to France, to the Aicardi-Goutières lab directly. And it was a spinal fluid diagnostic test. And I think at that point in time, they'd only identified AGS 1, 2, and 3, maybe. Wow. So he came back negative. And, we've done all this genetic testing, came back negative for any genetic mutations, and the AGS 1, 2, and 3 mutations that they knew about at that point. And so that was sort of put on the shelf in AGS diagnosis. We cycled through everyone else at Children's, every other specialty in practice. And then they pretty much cut us loose after about 2 years. Someone said, like, we have no idea. Good luck, right? And he was pretty sick at that point, like very, very, very small, had lost his motor skills. And, this like sort of adjacent story for my son is that within, like, between those years of 2003, 2005, 2006, like, we had no other tools at our disposal to try to change his quality of life on a daily basis. He was very uncomfortable. He had very serious GI issues. He didn't have seizures. He still had motor control. He could eat by mouth. He's never had a feeding tube during his life. And he was like just not gaining any weight. And so that was more his issue, right? Like, he was emaciated and malnourished, and we were feeding him this high quality, any sort of attribute you can think of, organic, blah, 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 right? Like gluten-free. And he still wasn't gaining any weight. And so my husband and I decided that we needed to rethink his diet, because we knew that some foods that we fed him aggravated his neurological symptoms. And the neurological symptoms at that point, because he had lost all of his voluntary motor control, were these reflexes, right? These reflexive positions, like very sort of newborn reflexes.
Yes.
So he would get into this position, like a reflex, and not be able to move through it or get out of it. He was so uncomfortable. And he was in a lot of pain. And so we were trying to change that. And the way we looked at that and approached that was through his diet. Like, we knew certain foods aggravated his GI, which then aggravated his neurological symptoms. And we needed to figure out what we could feed him that didn't do that, right? So it was this very sort of primal level of feeding him something, seeing him react to it, and then just taking it out of his diet and trying to substitute something else. So we reverse engineered in 2004, 2005, this keto diet for him that really, high fat, low carb, medium proteins. And then what are good and bad fats? What are good and bad proteins? What are good and bad carbs? How do we decide what those are? And so in doing that, we were able to relieve those GI issues. He started gaining weight, started sleeping for longer than 2 hours at a clip, which was what we'd been dealing with for many years. And, just kind of things started to ease up on a daily basis. That had been very much a struggle for several years. And so So we just kept leaning into that diet, really. And we had to make everything from scratch because you couldn't find those types of products on the shelf.
Of course.
And so this like side experiment that we were doing for him started working. We we were making things like bone broth and fermented foods, sauerkraut, kombucha, all these things, right?
That are figured it out. Yeah.
We figured it out and it worked for him. And what we were really trying to do was manage inflammation through his diet. Like we thought that this was something autoimmune, even though we didn't have that diagnosis.
Wow.
And we turned out to be right. And so, if I fast forward through that experience to when he finally got a diagnosis, it was in 2014, and he'd been accepted to an undiagnosed, it's called the Undiagnosed Disease Program at the National Institute of Health, which is outside of Washington, D.C., in Bethesda, Maryland. And it really is its last resort for people with, an illness, a disease that they've exhausted all options in testing, local, national options. They just can't find an answer to what's going on. So it ranges dramatically for people when they go there on what they're being seen for. But he was accepted into that program. And, it was after taking a break for several years. Scott and I, my husband and I, were just exhausted. By this point, I had 4 children. And we were just like, not sort of throwing our hands up like, okay, I guess this is just like, we just won't know what happened and what's wrong. We just won't ever have a diagnosis. We weren't like that. Like we continued to try to find answers. We continued to do testing. There's a great immunology hospital in Denver called National Jewish, and we did a lot of very sophisticated immunology testing there. And so we saw various abnormalities in his blood work, in spinal testing, and like lumbar puncture testing that we were doing. We saw all of these abnormal inflammatory markers and proteins. And so we were finding sort of bits and pieces of information, but clearly no big picture. And so we were still doing that testing, but we were just exhausted after a decade. And, I think my children at that point were like, they were maybe 11, 10, let's see, in 2012, which is when we decided to also start this business called Jackson's, where we make these sweet potato chips cooked in avocado oil, because they were something we made for him when we were making all of this food from scratch for his diet. We decided to launch this business in 2012, which was the same year that we applied to this NIH program. And also he had hip surgery because he had dislocated hips. So he was in a body cast all summer for that. And we're like, let's just launch a company at the same time and see how this all fleshes out.
Life still happens. Life still happens, especially when you have other kids that, don't have the same diagnosis, and you have a life too. So it's just a balancing act of all things. It doesn't mean that you're not trying or you're not feeling things. It's just, you have to. There's no option. You just have to keep going.
Yeah, you're right. You have to keep going. And that's part of staying sane, I think, and mentally healthy is like, you have to step back into your life. And we didn't for several years. I mean, we were just flailing, my husband and I, and our little like newborn daughter, because then I started to freak out, like, what's happening with him? And is this going to happen with her? Right? Like, how did we know that it wasn't going to? And the reason, I was already pregnant when we started doing this test. And then we decided to have 2 more children. And it was this very hard decision. We had done so much genetic testing that we were assured that this wasn't anything genetic. This was something spontaneous in Jackson. And it wasn't something he inherited, which turned out to be true when we got this AGS7 diagnosis. That was actually true, but it was still this leap of faith in
Yes.
2006 when I had another child, in 2009 when I had another child. And so, part of the decision making on that for us was just, sort of not knowing what was going to happen with Jackson, and having this experience be the only one that my daughter, Ella, my oldest daughter, had with him, right? Which was amazing and rewarding. And like the experience of our family caring for Jackson is something I would never trade. But I also didn't necessarily want her to be an only child at some point in time, or have him be the only experience that she had with a sibling, right? Like she couldn't fight with him and like pull his hair and do these sibling things. And to me and to my husband, we both come from very large families. It was just important. And so we decided to roll the dice and see what happened, and believe the doctors that had told us this was not genetic.
Yeah.
Even though, we didn't have other genetic diseases, we,
Yes.
we still were 100%.
And so, I mean, so many things happening. And in the midst of all of this, so what year is this when you already had your fourth child and you launched your business, and then you applied for the undiagnosed NIH program? About what year is this?
That was all in 2012. And so my father actually really pushed me to apply for that program. He kept saying, Megan, I think there's a shot. I think we should do this. Like, what do you have to lose? And I thought, well, I don't really have anything to lose, but it is a hell of a lot of work to apply.
Yes.
Like I had to send everything like he'd ever had done. And I happened to do that along the way. It was a good piece of advice someone had given me. Like after every test, get a copy of it. Get a CD with the MRI on it. Get a report. Like do it after every test. And I'm not a very organized person, and I took that insight to heart and actually did that. And so I did have folders of all of the tests and the reports and everything that came out of all of the things we had done for him. And so it wasn't that hard for me to get that bundled together and send that off for their review and, have that be part of the process. Had I not done that, it would have been not impossible, because as we know, as a child of special needs, as a parent of a child with special needs, like nothing's impossible. But it would have been hard. It would have been hard to find the time to do that. But I did it, and I really sort of did it to shut my dad up. Like, okay, I will do this. I don't have any expectations. There's a very, very low number of people who get accepted, and he ended up getting accepted. And so that their sort of application process, I'd say, took all of 2012. I probably applied in the middle of the year. And we heard back in, I'd say, like first couple of months of 2013. And they invited us to come, like scheduling took a while. And we ended up going to the National Institute of Health in person in September of 2013. And we spent a week there. We pretty much redid every test he'd ever had done: a muscle biopsy, lumbar puncture, MRI. The process itself was amazing. Like the physicians that are there, they're MDs and they're PhDs. And so they were very interested in a research part of this, right? That wasn't just this clinical experience. They really wanted to know, for instance, like all about the food we were feeding him and really get specific on it. And it was so lovely at the end of that week, because they said, after all of this information, we did all our own research this week, like you fed him the lowest inflammation diet that you could, as far as, not having this kind of prescribed diet for him, and continuing to do it by mouth and just blending everything together every day, multiple times a day. And so, so they were really optimistic that they would find something. And Dr. Vanderveer was part of the team at the NIH.
Wow.
In 2013, she was still working at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the side notes is that she happened to be the primary neurologist for Stephanie Weinberg and her family and her daughter, Abby. And so, Stephanie had a really good relationship with Vanderveer at that point in time and throughout Abby's life. And then that's how I got connected to her. And within a year of visiting there, so in 2014, almost exactly a year later, kind of September 2014, we got a call from that NIH team in sort of cooperation, working with Dr. Vanderveer as well as Dr. Crow, Yannick Crow, who also throughout Jackson's life was a great resource for him and for us, and said we have a diagnosis. And it was actually through Dr. Crow's work that he had discovered AGS7, and we could link Jackson's mutation to AGS7.
Wow. So Jackson, 2015, Jackson is 13 at this point, or 15?
Jackson was, so in 2014, he was 13. He was diagnosed when he was 13. He was born in 2001.
And your journey is just, wow. It was a roller coaster, and then the amount of work it took and just keep things going, figuring things out at home and so forth. How did that make you feel finally getting a diagnosis at that point?
It actually felt really good because we had felt like chickens with our heads cut off for a long time, just chasing after all these different things, right? And pursuing them. Like we had to dive in, we had to understand, we had to see if this was what the answer was, and then move on when it wasn't. And so there was a lot of scrambling like that for a long period of time. So getting a diagnosis felt good insofar as like we can direct all our energy and all of our focus to this particular disease. We can try to understand it. We can put, dollars behind it. We can put everything we've been doing for years here in the AGS space. And then, it was interesting because probably within less than a year, maybe within 6 to 9 months of getting that diagnosis, we got another call about this drug trial that was starting with Eli Lilly and the compassionate care trial. And Dr. Vanderveer thought Jackson was a good patient to recommend for that and to look into pursuing that. And so that seemed so fast after waiting so long for this diagnosis that he's going to be he could be part of an experimental drug trial and it might alleviate some of the symptoms that he still has, right? So then it seemed like it was moving at warp speed from then on, and he became one of the first patients on the baricitinib trial. At that point, it was done with Dr. Vanderveer at Children's National, so we were going to Washington, D.C., and he started that in May of 2016, he started that trial. Yeah. We had to go through all of these hoops for the compassionate care and all of the things that I'm sure other people who are part of the drug trial go through when they're trying to get signed up or join in.
Yes. I mean, I'm just in awe listening to your story, as a parent and everything that you had to go through. And sometimes and you can tell me how you feel about this, I don't necessarily like when people tell me you're inspirational, because it's not like I'm trying to be inspirational, but maybe it's more appropriate for me to say it to you because I am on a similar journey of what you've been through. And as someone who seems like in the weeds of it, in the middle of it, and what I thought my journey was long, it wasn't that long. And Noah was my second kid, and exactly how you said at the beginning, they did not believe everything I said, and they were like, you don't need to see a neurologist, you're fine. And to me, it was just like black and white. I was like, what are you talking about? There's something clearly wrong. And he was so uncomfortable. So hearing your story and hearing everything you went through. I mean, oh, Megan, because I just can't believe it. Like, that was just years, and I'm only on to year 2, so I can't believe it.
Well, I mean, it is hard when you're in the weeds, and those weeds are really difficult on a daily basis. It's a really hard disease to live with. Our children are uncomfortable most of the time, or you get them comfortable and think you're in a steady state, and then something spikes, or they get an illness, or you have to do a procedure or a test, and it's like there's just no steady state. And so on a daily basis, you're not quite sure what you're going to be dealing with. And and I think for us it was like he dictated our day, right?
Yes.
So we all revolved around Jackson, and if he was having a great day and felt good, maybe we could stay out a little later, out to dinner, or whatever it was we were doing, go to this sporting event, stay a little bit longer. But he dictated it, and no one cared. We were like, that was just our life, and no one knew anything different. It was like my other kids were like fine with it. Like, okay, well, Jackson's not feeling great, we have to go. Like, that was just it. And so I think, I think it's a really hard existence for everyone. And yet it's so rewarding. And I don't want to sound cliche in that. I feel like I can speak to that because Jackson passed away in 2017. So kind of 15 months after he started the drug trial, he passed away from the drug trial. And in losing sort of that purpose in my life, and I think I can say that for my husband, my kids, like, we didn't really know what to do. We just didn't know what to do. We didn't know what to do with our time. We didn't know what to do with our energy. Like, we revolved around him. He was our North Star. And so we had to figure out, like, how do we keep going? And what do we do with our days? And so I don't want to say, I don't want to sound cliche and say, like, it's rewarding and impactful. Like, it is what you have to do, obviously, on a daily basis to care for your child who can't care for themselves. But the purpose in that is something that I miss in my life. And I think the rest of my family does too.
Oh, Megan, you are putting my feelings into words, and that's beautiful, because Noah is our North Star, and he does dictate our days. He dictates whether we can go outside for a little bit longer, if we can do something, or if he's sick, if it's a doctor's appointment that we have to go to. But you're saying so many beautiful things in this chaotic life, and that we wouldn't trade Noah for anyone else. And I think all parents can say that, and all caregivers can say that, because it's just they're beautiful. They are beautiful, and I cannot picture my life without meeting them. And something you keep saying, and I want to ask you more about it. It's their sibling, the family and sibling dynamic, the love that they have for their sibling, because one, they don't know anything else besides that, so they're what I've seen from my 5-year-old. So I have Sammy's my oldest, and he is 5, and Noah's 2. And how Sammy knows that if Noah's coughing, that he goes and pats his little brother's chest, or if I start changing a diaper, he knows that I can't leave brother. And it's like he just knows beyond brother that he's also a caregiver. And it just comes so natural. So I think it would be very beneficial for our audience if you could just provide any words of wisdom for those parents that have, one or maybe even two in some cases are affected by Aicardi-Goutieres, but then the other siblings are not. Just any advice of comfort, because it is different. It is different. So we would love if you could share any words of wisdom on that.
My best words of advice would be, don't feel guilty. You're living in this very difficult space, and you can't feel guilty about the time that your child with AGS needs and whether that affects the time allocation and the availability you have for your other children. Like, there's only so much you can do, and don't feel any guilt around how you're sharing your love, your attention, your time, because you're only human, and you can only do so much. And I think, you know, I know in my own family, my other children, they know that to be true. They knew that from a young age, and they know that now. I mean, they are 14, 17, and 21 years old now, and you know, they would never speak any differently about that experience. Like, you didn't show me this, or you didn't give me enough of this, or you weren't available for me for this. Like, that never even would cross their mind, right? And they miss their brother in a different way than I do, and you know, on a daily basis. And you know, they also are inspired in their own lives to continue to be in these caregiver roles. So my oldest daughter is studying neuroscience, and you know, wants to be a doctor and focus on the special needs population. My, you know, third child, my daughter, wants to study nursing in college. My youngest son, like, works with the kids in school who have special needs, and like, you know, it's sort of a mentor and helps them get to classes, and just, you know, interacts and like plays basketball, and just like wants to be engaged. And so I think that those are not things I could have ever taught them. Those are things that speak to them from their heart and their experience. And they are richer and more mature and, you know, lovely children because of it. And so any, I can't stress enough, like, any guilt that you may feel, please set it aside, because it's not productive, it's not needed. And you know, that's one last thing that you need to put on your plate to try to deal with in the chaos of your daily life.
Those are the words and the advice that we needed to hear. And I am so thankful, Megan, that you are willing to share your journey and your family's journey and be able to speak to us about Jackson. And another thing that's really hard, but I think there are other families, parents and caregivers that may be thinking about this question, that if it's okay, we would like to ask you, is grieving, right? We all maybe experience to a certain degree, and we deal with it differently, anticipatory grief. But then there are other of us in our community who have actually are grieving, you know, the event actually happened. So I don't want to ask, how was it for you? But if you could share a little bit that may help other parents, of like just anything from your experience that you're willing to share with us about the grieving, and maybe like resources that helped you, or how you dealt with grieving, because maybe someone may be able to just feel less lonely if they hear it from you. I'm all right now, all I'm experiencing is the anticipatory grief. I'm not on the other side. So I would love for you to share a little bit of that, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I will say first and foremost that as part of the AGSAA organization, it's one of the tasks, I think, that we've put out there for ourselves to try to coordinate around the whole spectrum of this journey, from, you know, early and diagnosis to grief and loss. And And I think we've done some great things on parts of that journey. And I think there's some places that we have some voids and some gaps, and the loss and discussion around that, and support for the loss and grieving process is one thing I know that we're going to focus on over the next year. Because unfortunately, it is something that people are experiencing. And in my own case, I never really thought about it. I didn't have anticipatory grief. I didn't have this idea that we were going to lose Jackson. I mean, he was really healthy. And I guess maybe I was naive about that, but I tried to also stay optimistic, and that, that we could at least, even if we couldn't cure him at some point or find treatment for him, that we could, he had a quality of life, and we could try to prolong that as long as possible. And he had a pretty great quality of life. Like, he had a very active lifestyle, and we have an adaptive sports center where we live. And so he skied all season, like all winter. He would go rafting in the summer. Like, he was a normal kid, except he lived in a wheelchair. But and had good days and bad days, and we had to adjust accordingly. But he didn't have seizures, and he didn't have a lot of like complications, and so he was actually quite lucky, and we were as well. That but I think there was more available to him in certain ways. However, I think that was part of my naivete around having any idea that we could lose him, and so we were all very unprepared, and it was very sudden that we lost Jackson. So I kind of briefly mentioned this, and it like, we increased his dosage of baricitinib in July of 2017, and he died a few weeks later from pulmonary embolisms, like 3 or 4 pulmonary embolisms at birth. And so it was catastrophic. It was sudden. It was like, he was breathing and fine, and vomited, and then lost consciousness and died. And this all happened in like a 10-minute window. And so we were just stunned and in shock. Like, we kept him alive for so many years. Like, how did we lose him within a 10-minute window? Like, we could not wrap our heads around this. And, we were driving in the car, and we were on a several-hour drive. And so, it was my husband and myself and my youngest son, who was 8 at the time, and our dog. And like, we were going to Denver, which was about 3 hours away, and we were coming back that night. And so our daughters were home with a friend because they didn't want to come. Like literally, we were like left in the car and thought we'd be back later. And so it was this, like, it was just this event that was really hard for us to process and very traumatic, and sort of all happened on the side of the road. And we were actually in this very remote area that happened to have emergency services within minutes. Otherwise, we would have been in these like stretches of road that didn't have cell service, and couldn't have reached anyone. I mean, I really don't know what we would have done. So we're in this little pocket, like a couple miles of a zone that had cell service and actually emergency services, and a grief counselor on site, which was shocking to me. And she came while the EMTs were still there and working on him. And I thought, why is she here? Like, we don't need her. What is going on? Right. I mean, like, I couldn't even see clearly what was happening. And so, so my immediate thought, and somebody asked me, like, what was one of the hardest things that you did in that immediate sort of loss, like after losing him in those first few weeks? And like, I think the very hardest thing I did was get up the next morning and tell my 3 children, like, we're going to be fine. Like, we're going to be okay. We're going to get through this. And look them in the faces and like, Mom, no way. And I said, nope, we're going to be okay. Like, we have been through a lot with Jackson already. Like, we're prepared for this. We can do this. Like, it's going to be hard, but we're going to be okay. Like, we're going to get through it. And, they were like, like, how do we live without Jackson? Like, this is a piece of us. I mean, all these things and all these questions that I had to answer. And, if there's no guidebook for raising a child with special needs, there's no guidebook for grief and loss and conversations. And, I think I just did the best I could. And I knew that they needed my support, like more than my husband needed my support, more than I needed my support. Like, I just poured it into our children and met them where they were at, picked them up in school early if they needed it, like dropped everything and like was 100% available. No, I would like, there was no phone distraction. Like, someone came to me, one of my kids, and said, Mom, like, I'm really sad today. Okay, everything else is put aside. I'm here. I'm looking at you. Like, talk to me. I just wanted them to be able to verbalize what was going on, tell them I was feeling the same way. I was helping them as much as I could, providing resources. And, we got through it. Like, it was a lot of conversation, a lot of vulnerability, a lot of crying. And I think one of the things that actually helped us was that Jackson, it was actually pretty interesting because we were headed to Children's Hospital when he died. He had been not feeling great. We were going to run some tests to see if it was related to this increase of baricitinib. And so I'd been on the phone with Dr. Vanderveer multiple times throughout the previous few days, like, he's not really eating that much, or, he looks like he has some edema, like just some symptoms that were new. And so we ran some tests at our local hospital, and they were just very basic. And she wanted to run like the next level of tests. And I said, let's just go to Children's. It's a couple hours away, but we're going to have to go there if there's a complication anyway. So that's where we were headed. And so this happened like in this little town, and maybe an hour later, I'm still sort of on the side of the road trying to figure out, like, in shock, Jackson's deceased, like he's gone at that point. We're still in the ambulance, like it's still, and Dr. Vanderveer calls me, and she said, Megan, I've got everything set up for you when you get to Children. And I said, he died. Like, he just died. And she said, what do you mean? I go, I don't know what I mean. Like, I'm not sure what that means. Like, I don't know what happened, but like, he's gone. And, I tried to tell her really briefly, and then got off the phone, and she started to make some phone calls to Children's. And, the long and the short of that is that Jackson was the first patient that she was able to do an autopsy on and direct that autopsy and try to understand more about AGS through that process. And that actually made us feel good, like better, not good, but like, it made our family give us some comfort. Like, okay, like he's still helping this community, right? We were learning a lot from his experience with baricitinib and what we could and couldn't do, and obviously dosage. And then, we felt like, okay, he's still contributing some out of this. Like, so I think that felt like there was some meaning in that, or there was some comfort for us in that. But like, the reality of just losing him, again, losing that purpose, trying to figure out what do we do with all this time? Like, we now have time to, and we felt guilty about it, right? Yeah. It felt like we shouldn't have it. And what do we do with it? And should we do anything with it? And like, I don't know how to handle this. And like, those were some of the things we had to work through in those first few years, I'd say, after losing him.
So Megan, we are so thankful for you providing so much information, sharing your story, and through Jackson's legacy, still continuing to help, afterwards. And then you also devoting time every time we need you to volunteer to Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome Foundation. I'm just thankful because it's impacting my life. I don't know, it's impacting others' life because we speak about how amazing you are. And I know you don't have to do this, but I just want you to know that you are helping so many people still on a daily basis. And I'm sure this podcast is another way that you continue to contribute. And I wish I could say more than just thank you, but that's all I have to offer right now. And I'm just grateful for everything that you have shared with us.
Thank you, Betty. And you don't need to thank me. I really enjoy continuing to participate. It makes me feel connected to AGS and be part of this community and support it in any way that I can. I have the time to do it. And, I definitely have more time availability than you all and the parents who are taking care of the child on a daily basis. And so I want to be able to devote my energy to, continuing to try to find treatment options and hopefully cure at some point for AGS and whatever that requires from me.
Yes. Thank you so much. Any other last advice that you would like to say to the families, caregivers who are listening to, or even maybe in some cases patients that you're listening to, they're listening to our podcast?
I would just say, keep on keeping on. I mean, it's not easy. And, there are good days and bad days, as you all know, and ride the bad days out and enjoy the good days. I mean, one of the things that I shifted in my life significantly and just became more aware of after Jackson passed away was this idea of living in the present and being grateful and truly on a daily basis, right? Of giving thanks and recognizing small wins, recognizing, the good parts of that day and trying to let, those things that didn't go right or something that just, was not great, let it go and know that I need to conserve my energy for tomorrow because, if this experience has taught me one thing with not just my own child, but the other children and families that I know who have lost a child through AGS, Tina, Stephanie, and so many others that I can't name, is that, life is fleeting and there's no guarantee on tomorrow. And so the idea around embracing today and being present has really stuck with me, particularly since we lost Jackson.
Yes, I agree with everything you're saying, and I always try to remember and do my very best of just live in the present and being present, right? Being present for both of my kids. And Megan, one more time, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I will, if we have any questions from the audience, I will definitely send them your way so that way you can answer them for them. And thank you for everything you do for Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome Advocacy Association. It was great having you today.
Thank you, Betty. Thanks for having me.